Understanding local and domain users. In this video, I'll be doing a brief overview and discussion on understanding local and domain users. The concept of users and groups is complicated in Windows because there are two completely separate user account systems, local users and domain users. Which user account system a Windows computer uses depends on whether it is a member of a workgroup or an Active Directory domain. Windows 7 supports three types of networks: home groups, workgroups, and domains, as described in the following sections. Introducing the home group. New in Windows 7, a home group is a simplified networking paradigm that enables users connected to a home network to share the contents of their libraries without the need for creating user accounts and permissions. Introducing the workgroup. A workgroup is a collection of computers that are all peers. A peer network is one in which every computer can function as both a server by sharing its resources with other computers and a client by accessing the shared resources on other computers. On a workgroup network, each computer has its own set of users and groups that it uses to control access to its own resources. For example, if you want to use one computer to access resources on all four of the other computers on a 5-node workgroup network, you must have a user account on each of those four computers. As you connect to each computer, you are authenticated and authorized by each one. If effect, you are logging on to each computer individually. Although it is technically a separate authentication process every time a workgroup computer accesses another computer, this does not necessarily mean that users have to supply account names and passwords each time they connect to another computer. If a user has accounts with the same name and password on multiple workgroup computers, then authentication occurs automatically, with no user intervention. This is called pass-through authentication. If the passwords for the accounts are different, however, a manual authentication is necessary for each one. Introducing the domain. A domain is a collection of computers that all utilize a central directory service for authentication and authorization. A directory service is a collection of logical objects that represent various types of network resources, such as computers, applications, users, and groups. Each object consists of attributes that contain information about the object. Take note, do not confuse an Active Directory Domain Services (ADDS) domain with a domain name system (DNS) domain. An ADDS domain is a collection of Windows computers that are all joined to the Windows Directory Service. A DNS domain is a collection of Internet host names used by computers that can be running any operating system. To create a domain, you must have at least one Windows server with the Active Directory Domain Services (ADDS) directory service installed. This server is called a domain controller. Each of the computers then joins the domain and is represented by a computer object. In the same way, administrators create user objects that represent human users. In Windows networking, the main difference between a domain and a workgroup is that users log on to the domain once, rather than each computer individually. When users attempt to access network resources, the individual computers hosting the resources send authorization requests to the domain controller, rather than handling the authorizations themselves. Differentiating local and domain users. The primary advantage of a domain over a workgroup is that administrators only have to create one user account for each person, while workgroups can require many different user accounts for one person. If, on a workgroup network, a user's password is lost or compromised, someone must change that password on every computer where that user has an account. On a domain, there is only one user account for each person, so only one password change is needed. Windows 7 computers also have a need for local user accounts for administrative access to the system, if for no other reason. For networking purposes, though, it is typical to use local user accounts or domain user accounts, but not both. Workgroup networks are typically small and informal, with users administering their own computers. Domain networks are usually larger and have dedicated network administrators responsible for managing user accounts and controlling access to network resources. Local and domain users are different in several important ways. You use different tools to create and manage the two types of users, and the user accounts themselves are different in composition. As mentioned earlier, a user account consists of attributes, which contain information about the user. Domain users have many more attributes than local users. As a demonstration of this, Figure 9-1 and 9-2 contain the property sheet of a local user account and a domain user account. Notice that the property sheet for the local user has only 3 tabs, while the domain user sheet has 15. This means that the domain user account can store a great deal more information about the user and can access many more different kinds of network resources. Table 9-1 lists some of the other differences between local and domain users. Question: what tools do you use to manage user accounts? Local users: the User Accounts Control Panel or the Local Users and Groups Snap-in for Microsoft Management Console. Domain users: the Active Directory users and Computers MMC Snap-in. Question: where are the user accounts stored? Local users: in the Security Account Manager, SAM, on the local computer. Domain users: on the Active Directory Domain Services domain controllers. Question: what can you access with the user account? Local users: local computer resources only. Domain users: all domain and network resources. Question: what restrictions are there on the username? Local users: each username must be unique on the computer. Domain users: each username must be unique in the directory. As a technical specialist, the type of user accounts you work with depends on the nature of the networks you manage and their security requirements. Small businesses are more likely to use workgroup networking, in which case you will be working with local user accounts. Depending on the capabilities of the users, you might have to set up all of the user accounts for all of the computers on the network. Or you might be able to show the users how to create accounts on their own computers. Local users are relatively simple to create and manage, and a workgroup network is often treated casually. If your client is a medium or large business, it is more likely to be running an AD/DS domain, in which case you will be working primarily with domain user accounts. The question of whether to host a Windows domain is a major decision that an organization usually makes when they are designing and installing a network. Hosting a Windows domain is a costly undertaking, both in terms of the additional hardware and software required and in terms of the time and effort needed for planning and deployment. Introducing built-in local users. As mentioned earlier, Windows 7, like the other Windows Workstation operating systems, always has a need for local user accounts. When you perform a standard interactive installation of Windows 7, you are required to create one user account. In addition, the setup program automatically creates a number of other user accounts. The following user accounts are built in on Windows 7. Administrator. During a typical Windows 7 installation, the setup program creates an administrator account and makes it a member of the administrators group, giving it complete access to all areas of the operating system. However, the setup program leaves the account in a disabled state and does not assign it a password. New user account. During the operating system installation process, the installer must specify the name for a new user account, which the setup program creates and adds to the administrators group. This grants the new account full access to the operating system. The installer decides whether to assign a password to this account. Windows 7 uses this account for its initial logons. Guests. This account is designed for users who require only temporary access to the computer and who do not need high levels of access. The guest account is disabled by default and is a member only of the guest group. In addition to these accounts, Windows also creates a number of system and service accounts, none of which you have to manipulate directly. Take note, after the Windows installation is completed, you might want to consider enabling the administrator account and assigning it a strong password. This will provide you with administrative access to the system, even if your main user account becomes compromised. That completes this brief overview and discussion on understanding local and domain users.